woman is standing in a crowd, watching a man die on a Roman cross. She's not screaming. She is not weeping. She is doing the thing people do when the worst thing has finally arrived. There's nothing left to be done about it. She's just staring, frozen, as if her body has forgotten how to move. The man on the cross is her son. And as she watches the soldiers and the blood and the slow, patient work of an empire killing her boy, her mind does what a mind does to survive a moment like this. It leaves. It goes back. More than 30 years earlier, she had been a girl of 16 with a nursing baby in her arms. That same baby. And on a dusty road in her own home country, she had already seen this exact thing once before. Crosses. Not one, not a dozen, hundreds of them. And then hundreds more, 2,000 in a single season, raised along the roads of Galilee when Rome crushed a revolt and left the bodies up to rot so that everyone who walked past would learn the lesson. Some of these people on crosses were her own family members. Rotting flesh and decomposition was attracting wild creatures to eat the remains. The smoke from the burning towns was still hanging in the air, and a 16-year-old mother stood in the middle of it, holding her firstborn, with nowhere to turn her eyes that did not have a dying man on it. And this image is seared into my mind. The baby in her arms had his eyes open as well. An infant, taking in the world the way infants do, looking out across a forest of Roman crosses. As if before he could walk, before he could even say a single word, he was being shown the shape of his own ending. That baby would spend his whole life walking toward one of those crosses, and the girl holding him would spend hers walking a step behind, watching it come. Now, she's at the far end of that life, watching the thing she first saw when he was too young to remember it. The umpire kept its promise. The crosses came back, this time for him. The world will remember the man on that hill for 2,000 years. It will build cathedrals to him. It will fight wars over him. It will put his face in more homes than any other human being who has ever lived. And it will almost completely forget the woman standing in front of the cross and the frightened 16-year-old she once was. Her name was Mary. Before he was a savior, before the creeds and the councils, before anyone on earth called him the Son of God, she taught him to walk. The historian James Tabor calls her the best known and least known woman in all of history. So we are going to do the thing movies never do. We're not going to start at the manger, or the miracles, or the cross. We're going to start with her. A frightened teenager on a road full of crosses, holding the baby the whole world would one day fight over, with no idea she would live to watch him die on one. To understand how that happened, and how she got erased from her own son's story, we have to begin again with everything the paintings left out. Here's the strange thing about both of them, the mother and the son. We have buried two real people under 2,000 years of paint. For most of us, the life of Jesus is about 5 scenes long: a birth, a few sermons, a mill, a trial, and a cross. Stretch those across a man who lived more than 30 years, and almost the entire life is blank. The boy, the worker, the brother, the son, All of it painted over. Mary is even worse. People remember a young virgin in A Christmas Story who then reappears decades later at the foot of a cross. And in between? Nothing. Tabor's word for it is that she is the most erased woman in history. He argues that the erasing was not an accident. It was done on purpose, over generations, to turn a flesh and blood Jewish mother of a large family into a silent, sexless statue. This film tries to put both of them back, not with theology, with a world, with the dirt, and the taxes, and the roads, and the work, and the fear that actually surrounded them. And I'm gonna have to keep it real with you. We do not have a time machine. No one filmed Nazareth. Anyone who hands you the exact life of Jesus hour by hour is selling you something. So this is not the final word. It is a reconstruction. We take what we actually have, the archaeology, the geography, the Roman records, the historian Josephus who lived in this world, the oldest layers of the Gospels, and the decades of digging and detective work that James Tabor poured into his book on Mary, and we build the most likely version of the world that made them. Then we put two humans back inside it. Everyone carries a Jesus, the Sunday school one, the political one, the one on the candle at the store. This is one more attempt, and it comes with its homework shown. And it exists because of a friend, Aaron, who runs the channel Jesus DeChurched. He put up the funding for this film, and then did the rarest thing a backer can do. He stepped back and said, "Make the best version of this you can." Really, Aaron, thank you. So here is that version. You can keep every belief you walked in with. Read the miracles literally, if that is your faith. Read them as legend, if it is not. I'm not here to take that from you. I'm only asking that before you decide what these two people mean, you spend a few hours finding out who they were and what it cost them. It starts with a question the church has been answering and re-answering for 2,000 years. Who was the father of Mary's child? Go to the oldest gospel, Mark, and listen to how the people of his own town describe Jesus. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Read fast and it is nothing. Slow down and it's strange. In that world, you named a man for his father, son of Joseph, son of Jacob. That was your identity, your standing, your address. Calling a grown man the son of his mother in his own town to his face was not how people spoke, unless they were making a point. Start with the simplest explanation. Joseph is never mentioned as alive during the ministry. The last time any source places him with the family, Jesus is 12 years old. If your father is long dead and your mother is the one still in the village, people might name you for her, for no darker reason than that. It may be the whole answer. But both birth stories, the one in Matthew and the one in Luke, quietly admit something underneath the angels and the star. They both say, in their own way, that Joseph was not the biological father. Matthew traces Joseph's line and then stops short and calls him the husband of Mary, not the father of Jesus. Luke says Jesus was, and I am quoting the careful word, supposedly the son of Joseph. Tabor's point is simple. Strip away the theology these writers built a generation later, and you're left with a historical core they did not invent and could not hide. Mary was pregnant before the marriage, and the child was not Joseph's. So who was the father? I'm going to be brief about this on purpose. The honest answer is that we cannot know for certain. And this film is about a woman, not a paternity test. But the question was asked from the very beginning. So let me walk it once, carefully, and then set it down. There is a dark reading I have to put on the table, because serious scholars have, and because it is true to the world Mary lived in. The New Testament scholar James Tabor argued that a pregnancy like this one in an occupied country could have begun in sexual violence. Occupation and rape travel together. The army that would later raise 2,000 crosses on these roads did not leave the women of this land untouched, and a poor teenage girl was among the most defenseless people in it. But the evidence points away from that, and James Tabor lays out the reason plainly. At the time Mary became pregnant, there were no Roman soldiers stationed anywhere near Nazareth or Sepphoris. The legions were north, way north, in Syria. Herod still had the country locked down. There was no garrison in those hills to fear. So as much as the darker story fits the general cruelty of the age, it does not fit this place at this moment. Most likely, Mary was not raped. The likelier story is the kind that played out in villages across that world. A young woman became close with someone before her marriage was arranged, and when her parents pressed a match with an older craftsman named Joseph, she refused to give up the child. There's an old name tangled into it: Yeshua ben Pantera, son of Pantera, which turns up in early Jewish sources. You may have heard it waved around as proof of a Roman soldier father. Tabor argues it may be nothing of the kind, possibly even a name carried in Mary's own family line. But either way, it does not settle the question. So picture the one document this story never had: a birth certificate, with a single blank line for the father. There are only 3 names anyone has ever tried to write on that line. The first is Joseph, the man who raised him and gave him a trade, though the Gospels themselves admit the boy was not his by blood. The second is God, which is the answer of faith and not a question history can vindicate or the other. The third is that other man, remembered only as Pantera. History can argue between Joseph and Pantera. It cannot touch the claim about God at all. And so after surveying the only 3 names anyone has ever proposed, Tabor writes the only honest entry there is: Father unknown. 2 words, and a blank we are not going to pretend to fill, because what survives every version of the story is not the father's name, it is the girl. A young woman of about 15 carried a pregnancy that the law of her world could have answered with a pile of stones by stoning her. And she did not let go of the child. She walked 100 miles south to her kinswoman Elizabeth to have him in peace, and she raised him. The father's line stays blank. Every other line on that certificate she filled in herself. In Tabor's telling, that refusal to let go is the first act of the most influential woman who ever lived. And she was not the peasant of the postcard. Tabor reads the sources as pointing to something far more striking. A young woman he calls doubly royal. On one side, the blood of King David, the royal house of Israel, which would make any son of hers a born claimant to the throne Rome was watching for. And this is not a leap. Our earliest source, Paul, says plainly that Jesus came from the seed of David according to the flesh, a physical bloodline. But the Gospels themselves admit Joseph was not the biological father. So follow it through. If the royal blood was real and it did not come from Joseph, then it came from her. On the other side, a priestly line through the same family ties that bound Mary to Elizabeth, a daughter of Aaron. The blood of the king and the blood of the priest meeting in one teenage daughter. A girl of royal and priestly blood, possibly raised with some comfort in a Roman city, ends up a pregnant teenager in a village so small the wider world never bothered to name it, married to a working man, about to raise a house full of children alone, under an empire that was about to show her exactly what it did to people from her hills. Because a year or two after the baby came, the country caught fire, and Mary was standing in it. The land Mary lived in had a king named Herod, and Herod was Rome's man. He kept his crown by keeping the peace Rome wanted and sending the taxes Rome expected. He built like a pharaoh, harbors and fortresses, and a temple that took a generation, and somebody in the hills had to pay for all of it. People like Mary's family. Then, in the year we mark as 4 before the Common Era, Herod died, and the kingdom one ruthless old man had held shut by force sprang open. Revolt broke out across the country, and it broke out hardest right next to Nazareth, in Sepphoris, the capital. A rebel named Judas, son of Hezekiah, son of an earlier rebel Herod had killed, broke into the royal armory, armed his followers, and had himself declared king. He was not the only one. Josephus remembers that year as the year the country threw up would-be messiahs in 3 different regions at once. Rome's answer came down from the north. The governor of Syria, a man named Varus, marched his legions south to put the country back in its box. According to Josephus, who is our main source for all of this, the Romans burned Sepphoris to the ground and sold its people into slavery. And then they did the thing Rome did to rebels, the thing that turns this entire story into a circle. When Varus was finished, Josephus says he crucified 2,000 men. 2,000 crosses along the roads of this small country, the bodies left up for days on purpose, so that everyone walking those roads would understand the price of defiance. And Mary was inside it. The geography all but forces that. Sepphoris is 4 miles from Nazareth, close enough that you can stand on the hills above one and see the other. A 16-year-old girl from the next village, a nursing infant on her hip, born only the autumn before, was near enough to watch the smoke climb off the burning capital and the crosses go up along the roads. She did not read about this in a book. She breathed it. Sit with the geography of that, not the sentiment of it. The cross was not a symbol yet. It was a roadside fact. It was the smell on the wind over a 16-year-old mother holding her firstborn, the same son we opened this film watching the empire kill. The empire that would one day kill her son had already shown her, when he was too young to remember, exactly what it did to Galileans who stepped out of line. She raised him in the memory of it. Tabor's point is that you cannot understand a single thing the grown man says about empire and violence and the meek and the kingdom of God without this. He did not get those ideas from scrolls alone. He heard them first in the world his mother survived, secondhand from a woman who watched it happen. So picture the household the Gospels actually give us. A mother of royal blood, reduced to a widow in a backwater. A first son, the eldest of 8. The 4 brothers, James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and at least 2 sisters, and a father who, by the time the real story starts, is simply gone. Which means the boy grew up fast, as the man of a poor house, learning a trade because the family needed the money. 4 miles from the rubble of a city he had been carried through as a baby while it burned. Now ask where a boy like that goes to find work. The answer is the same city, because while Mary watched Sepphoris burn, she also lived to watch it rise again, and the rebuilding of it is where her son learned to use his hands. Nazareth in the 1st century was nothing. The archaeology keeps confirming it. A few hundred people cut into a hillside, terraced plots, a spring, tombs in the rock, so small that almost no ancient writer outside the Gospels bothers to name it. 4 miles over the next hills sat Sepphoris, and Sepphoris was the opposite of nothing. After Varus burned it, Herod's son Antipas rebuilt it from the ground up into his capital. Josephus, who saw it in its glory, calls it the ornament of the Galilee. Picture what that rebuild actually was. A city of perhaps 2,000 people, rising out of ashes over 20 years. Limestone paved streets in a grid, colonnades, 2 markets, a theater, the palace of the ruler himself. For 2 decades, the single biggest source of work in the whole region sat 4 miles from Mary's door. This was never one man alone with a chisel. It was a family trade. Joseph was a tekton too, and the Gospels still call Jesus the tekton's son. With a stone capital going up for 20 years just 4 miles away, a builder with sons had the best problem in that economy, more work than one pair of hands could finish. So set aside the picture of a poor boy left adrift. Tabor's reconstruction is a working family with a craft and steady demand, a father taking his older boys onto the job, teaching them to read stone and raise a wall, the way a trade passed from father to son in that world. Joseph most likely lived to see his sons into that trade. Only later, once they were grown, does he drop out of the record, and Mary is the one left to carry the family forward. There's a detail Tabor adds that sharpens it to a point. He thinks Mary's own parents, Jesus' grandparents, may have come from Sepphoris, which means the boy was not just near that city, he may have had family in it, and walked to it not only for work, but to see his grandparents, growing up with 1 foot in a tiny Jewish village and 1 foot in a Roman city full of Greek and trade and money. So when the Gospels tell us his trade, pay attention to the word, because it is wider than the picture in your head. Mark calls him a tekton. We translate tekton as carpenter, and that is the painting we all carry, the gentleman in a wood shop. That reading is old and it deserves the floor, but Tabor points out what the word actually covers. Tekton means builder, a maker of things, in wood, yes, and just as easily in stone. Our word architect comes straight from it. In a land where the houses and walls and presses and public buildings were cut from limestone, a village builder was likely to be shaping rock as timber. Put that word next to that city, a stone capital rising 4 miles away for 20 years, and a different man comes into focus. Not the carpenter of the painting, a builder with limestone dust ground into his hands, someone who knew the weight of a dressed block and what it took to set one true. I want to be clear that this is a reading, not a certainty. We cannot dig up his tools. The honest position is that tekton covers both trades, and the wood tradition has every right to stand. But listen to what the grown man reaches for whenever he wants an image, and ask which workshop it sounds like. He talks about a house built on rock that stands in the storm, and a house on sand that falls. He talks about counting the cost before you raise a tower, and his followers from the very start could not stop describing him with one image in particular: a stone. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. The cornerstone. The one block you set first and set perfectly, because every other stone in the building takes its line from it. They grabbed that image and pressed it onto him. The rejected stone that turns out to be the one the whole thing rests on? There's a famous line later about building a church on a rock. A lot of historians doubt that particular saying goes back to Jesus at all, and think it belongs to the later church. So I will not lean my case on it. I do not need to. The pattern is already there without it. A movement that could not stop describing its founder in the language of building and stone? Maybe that is just theology reaching for a metaphor, or maybe the metaphor stuck because it fits the hands of the man it was about. And hold the two pictures Tabor sets side by side, because the man grew up inside both of them. One is Sepphoris in flames, with Roman crosses on the road, and his neighbors marched off in chains. Some are likely his family as well. The other is Sepphoris rebuilt, gleaming, the boom town that fed his family, built in part by his own hands and the hands of men like him for the people who collaborated and got rich. He grew up walking between those two cities every day, the burned one and the golden one. He knew exactly who paid for the gold. Forget the postcard. The Galilee of the imagination is empty and quiet. A few shepherds on a brown hill, a world standing still. The real one was loud. It sat on trade roads. Caravans moved through it. In the markets you would hear Aramaic in the street, the language of the home, with Hebrew kept for scripture, Greek for business, and Latin barking out of the soldiers. A builder who walked to a Roman city every day would have caught all four. Down at the Sea of Galilee, the fishermen of Capernaum and Magdala worked their nets under license and under tax. Even the water was money, and the money was watched by Rome. Rome named it Lake Tiberias for a reason. And over all of it sat the squeeze. 3 hands reached into every harvest. Rome took its tribute. Antipas took his cut to pay for his cities. The temple system took its dues. A small farmer could be taxed from 3 directions at once, and when a bad year came, he borrowed, and when he could not repay, he lost the land. The man who lost the land became a day laborer, standing in the market at dawn, hoping someone would hire him for the afternoon. Then there are the stories Jesus tells. Ask where they came from. He tells one about laborers hired by the hour, some at dawn, some not until the last hour of the day, all of them desperate for the work. He did not invent that scene. He stood in it. He tells one about a man drowning in debt to a master, begging for time, about an absent landlord who plants a vineyard, leaves, and sends men to collect from tenants who decide they have had enough. These are not abstractions, it is the local economy with the names changed. He tells one about a woman who loses a single coin and lights a lamp and sweeps the whole house until she finds it, because for her 1 coin was not pocket change. It was the difference between eating and not. Only someone who had lived with that woman tells the story that way. And remember whose house he grew up in? A widow. raising 8 children on a working man's wages. He had watched his own mother sweep that floor. And he tells one about a rich man whose fields do so well, he tears down his barns to build bigger ones and dies the same night with the bigger barns half built. A man who spent his life on the scaffolds of other people's wealth knows exactly who that story is aimed at. But here's the move I want you to see, because it changes how his words sound. We're taught to hear his teaching as timeless wisdom drifting down from above. Put it back in this valley, and it stops drifting. It is ground level. It is about this land, these taxes, that debt, those laborers, this hunger. Jesus is describing his neighbors and his own mother, and then asking a question that makes the comfortable squirm. Tabor adds one more layer to it, and it's worth keeping. When you hear the grown man say, "Do good to those who wrong you," or "Do not judge by appearances," you may be hearing Mary. A mother teaches her children how to live long before any prophet preaches. The voice from the hillside may be carrying the voice from the kitchen. Either way, the teaching did not come from a mountain top. It came from the market, the quarry, the lake shore, the tax line, and a widow's house. But there's one piece still missing, and without it, nothing that comes next makes sense. Because this builder and the family around him did not think of themselves as nobodies waiting for nothing. They thought they were waiting for the end of the age, and not for one rescuer, for 2. Ask most people how many messiahs the Jews were waiting for, and they will say 1. A single anointed king who would throw out the Romans and put the world right. That is not what the oldest texts actually say. Down by the Dead Sea, at a place called Qumran, a community of Jews sealed a library in clay jars and hid it in caves, where it sat for nearly 2,000 years until a shepherd stumbled into it in 1947. We call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the scrolls describe a hope with 2 figures in it, not 1, until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Messiahs plural. The word Messiah just means anointed one, a person poured over with oil and set apart for a job. And this community was waiting for 2, one anointed out of the house of Aaron, the priestly line, one anointed out of the house of David, the royal line, a priest and a king. The priest to make the nation holy, the king to make it free. And in their texts, the priest ranks first. Even at the banquet of the last days, the scrolls say the priest blesses the bread before the king of Israel reaches for it. Now set that hope next to 2 cousins, born half a year apart into the same frightened family. Take John first. Luke is unusually specific about his pedigree. John's father, Zechariah, was a priest who served at the altar in the temple. His mother, Elizabeth, came from the daughters of Aaron. On both sides, John was born into the priestly line. There was a priest named Zechariah, and he and his wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. If anyone in that generation was bred to be the anointed priest, the Messiah of Aaron, it was John. The priestly Messiah was supposed to come from exactly this bloodline. John was born standing in it. And Jesus, our earliest witness, is not a gospel. It is Paul, writing to the believers in Rome about 25 years after the crucifixion, before a single gospel existed. And the very first thing Paul says about Jesus in the opening lines of the letter is the bloodline, descended from David according to the flesh. According to the flesh. Not a metaphor, a body, a family, a line that ran back to King David, the royal line, the Messiah of Israel. So look at what is standing in this one family: a priest's son and a king's heir, the two anointed lines of the oldest Jewish hope, alive at the same moment, related by blood through their mothers. Tabor's argument is that this is not a coincidence the movement stumbled into later. It is the point. These two men and the family behind them believed they were the fulfillment of the two Messiah hope, the priest and the king, and the priest came first, which is why when the builder from Nazareth finally went looking for the end of the world, he did not start a movement. He joined one. He went to the priest. He went to John. Start with the most awkward fact in the whole story of Jesus. Awkward not for us, but for the people who first told it. Every one of the Gospels admits that Jesus began by being baptized by another man, a preacher out in the desert named John. And in that world, the one who does the baptizing is the senior. The one who gets baptized is the follower. The one being washed, that one is the one who needs to change. Watch how badly that rattled the early church. Matthew has John try to talk Jesus out of it. The later Gospels shrink the scene. By the time you reach the Gospel of John, it has almost vanished. They are squirming, and historians have a name for the kind of detail a movement keeps even though it embarrasses them. They call it bedrock. You do not invent a story that makes your founder look like someone else's disciple. You keep it only because it happened. So before Jesus preached, he listened. Before he gathered followers, he followed. And the man he followed first was John, the priest's son, the cousin, possibly the first of the two anointed ones the family was waiting for. Remember where Mary went when she was pregnant and frightened? She ran 100 miles south to her kinswoman Elizabeth. Luke says Elizabeth was 6 months further along, carrying the boy who would become John. The refuge Mary fled to as a teenager was the household that produced the prophet who would one day baptize her son. These two were family before they were anything else. John was not gentle. He stood in the Jordan, down in the hottest, lowest part of the rift, and told everyone who waded out to him that the world they knew was finished, that God was about to break in, judge the powerful, and turn the whole order over, that they had better wash and change now, while there was still time. And the crowds came, including one day a builder from Nazareth. And John was not improvising. He was standing inside a script 7 centuries old. The prophet Isaiah had written of a voice crying out in the wilderness. A voice cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. That one line had already sent another movement into this same desert 100 years earlier. The people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community at Qumran, read it and went out to prepare, certain the end of the age was close. John took up the same text in the same wilderness with the same charge. The time is at hand. Wash. Change. The judgment is coming. Now watch what Jesus says about this man in some of the oldest sayings we have, the ones scholars find sitting in both Matthew and Luke and trace to a source older than either. Among those born of women, none has arisen greater than John the Baptist. None greater. Not Moses, not David, not Abraham. The scholar James McGrath, who has spent years reconstructing the historical John, argues that Jesus meant exactly what he said. In his own eyes, Jesus ranked John even above himself. The later church could not live with that, so it bolted on a softening line, but the raw saying is plain. And there is a second saying easy to walk straight past that may be the most revealing words in the Gospels about who taught whom. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone when fully trained will be like his teacher. McGrath's reading is that when Jesus first said that, he was not talking about his own followers. He was talking about himself and John. A disciple is not above his teacher. The fully trained disciple becomes like his teacher. Jesus was the disciple. John was the teacher. Jesus was telling people he hoped to grow into the man who had baptized him. We are so used to John as the warm-up act, the finger pointing at the main attraction, that we miss what the earliest material keeps saying. For a reason, in the Jordan, Jesus of Nazareth was a student, and the man he studied under was his own cousin, the priest, the senior of the two anointed ones. And listen to what Jesus does when he finally starts speaking for himself. He does not write a new headline, he picks up John's. The kingdom of God is at hand. That was John's fire, now in Jesus' mouth. And then the story turns dark, the way it always does in this country, because the same ruler who rebuilt the city Jesus worked in is the one who killed the man Jesus followed. Herod Antipas, who turned Sepphoris into his ornament, arrested John, shut him in a desert fortress, and had him beheaded. The reason was not really a dancing girl and a grudge, whatever the Gospels later dramatized. Josephus, writing decades afterward with no theological stake in any of it, tells us plainly why Antipas did it. He was afraid. John was pulling crowds, and a man who pulls a crowd in an occupied country is a political problem. And political problems, well, they get removed. Sit with what that did to Jesus. The man who baptized him, the prophet from the household that once sheltered his mother, was dead at the hands of the state for doing the exact thing Jesus had just begun. He had a working model of where this road led. He had watched it end. And do not forget who else this death belonged to. It belonged to Mary, because John was not a stranger to her. Go back to the frightened pregnant teenager who ran south to escape the whispers. The kinswoman who took her in, Elizabeth, was John's mother. The two women were family. Luke says they were carrying their boys at the same time. John just 6 months ahead of Jesus, and that Mary stayed with Elizabeth for 3 months while both of them were pregnant. Mary may have even been the first person to ever touch John when Elizabeth gave birth to him. Before either child could speak, their mothers had held each other through 2 impossible pregnancies in a dangerous world. So when the head of John the Baptizer was carried out of a desert fortress on a platter, it was not a piece of news to Mary. It was a death in the family. This was very personal. The first of these cousins, these anointed sons of one bloodline, to be killed by the powers of this world. And if she was watching, and a mother in that country watched everything, she had just been shown what the empire and the priesthood did to the men of her family who told the truth too loudly. John was the warning. Her own sons were next. In our earliest gospel, it is precisely after John is arrested that Jesus stops being a follower and becomes a voice of his own. The student picked up the teacher's message and carried it the rest of the way. John had showed him it could be done. John had also shown him exactly what it would cost. So Jesus went back up to Galilee, and he started saying something of his own. Not a new message, John's message, but carried now in the mouth of the heir of David to the poorest people in the country. And what he said, and the many gathered to say it with, is the reason a builder from Nazareth ended up on a Roman cross. The first thing he does is strange, and we have stopped noticing how strange. He picks 12 men, not 10, not a round dozen by accident, 12. And in this country, in this century, the number 12 means one thing: the 12 tribes of Israel. Tabor's point is that this is not a casual choice. It is a flag planted in the ground. Israel had not been a whole nation of 12 tribes for 700 years. To pick 12 men and gather them around you is to announce that you are putting Israel back together, that the scattered nation is being made one again, under a new leadership, for a kingdom that is coming. And Jesus says it out loud to the 12, in words even the later church kept. You will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Thrones. He's not promising these fishermen and laborers a place in heaven. He is promising them seats in a government, his government, the cabinet of a kingdom that has not arrived yet but is, he keeps insisting, about to. The 12 are not a prayer group. In Tabor's reading, they are a provisional administration for the world that is coming when God takes the throne and the Romans are swept off it. So we have to be clear about what this kingdom of God actually meant to him, because 2,000 years of sermons have moved it somewhere it was never meant to be. He was not talking about going to heaven when you die. He was talking about heaven coming here. The kingdom of God was an event on this earth soon, in which God would break in, throw down the powerful, lift up the poor, and rule. It was the same apocalyptic fire John had preached in the river, and it was thoroughly, completely Jewish. And the word kingdom was not vague. The Jewish prophets had spelled out what it would do. Daniel had seen it as a stone that smashes every empire on earth to dust, and then grows until it fills the whole world. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Isaiah had seen the other half of it. The scattered tribes of Israel gathered home from every nation on earth, the nations themselves streaming in, the swords beaten into plows. No one training for war anymore. That is what this kingdom meant to a Jew in Jesus' century. Not a church, and not an afterlife. The end of every empire and the start of peace here on the ground. Listen to the prayer he taught them, the one prayed in a billion-mouth sense, and hear what it actually asks for. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. On earth, not a ticket off the earth. The whole hope is that the earth gets fixed, and the next line is a poor man's line. Not give me riches, not give me a mansion in the sky. Give us this day our daily bread. Bread for today. That is the prayer of a person who is not sure about tomorrow. The prayer of the day laborers and the indebted farmers and the widow sweeping for a coin. The people we met back in the markets of Galilee. He built his whole movement out of them, and he told them the thing no one in power ever told them, that the kingdom was theirs. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. That is not comfort. That is a reversal and a threat. If the kingdom belongs to the poor and the hungry, then it does not belong to the rich and the fool. And he said that part too. The last would be first. The first would be last. The mighty pulled from their thrones, the lowly lifted up. To a peasant in Galilee, that was the best news in the world. To the people running the country for Rome, it was a man telling a crowd of the desperate that their turn was coming and that the powerful were finished. And one more thing, because it matters, because the church spent centuries hiding it. He was not starting a new religion. He was a Jew, calling Jews back to the God of Israel, inside the law of Moses, which he kept and argued about like the rabbi he effectively was. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Tabor hammers this, and the earliest evidence backs him. There is no Christianity yet. There is a Jewish prophet of the house of David with a Jewish message, gathering a Jewish movement, announcing a Jewish kingdom, with his own brothers somewhere in the circle around him. The healings and the exorcisms people remember were not, to him, proofs that he was God. There were signs that the kingdom was already breaking in, that the old powers were losing their grip, that the end of the age had started. And remember the two anointed ones from the river, John the priest and this man, the heir of David, the king. Choosing 12 to rule the 12 tribes was the most Davidic move a claimant could make. Now put all of that in front of a Roman governor and a collaborating priesthood, a man with a following announcing that a kingdom is coming to replace the present order, naming 12 to rule it, calling the poor its true heirs and the powerful its losers, drawing crowds in an occupied land already primed to revolt. You do not have to think he planned an uprising to see the problem. Rome did not wait to find out what such men intended. Rome removed them. And then he did the most dangerous thing of all. He decided to take that message to the one place it could not be ignored. At Passover, the festival of liberation, when Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims dreaming of exactly the kind of rescue he was preaching. He set his face south and started up the road to the capital. To get from Galilee to Jerusalem on foot, you do not walk a flat line on a map. You ride a roller coaster carved by an earthquake fault. 3 times a year, for the great festivals, the roads filled with pilgrims doing exactly this. At Passover, the country emptied and poured south toward the temple. A family from Nazareth joined that river of people. Tabor notes that the Gospels have Mary and Joseph making this trip year by year. The boy in this story walked this road many times before he walked it for the last time. Many took this route down the Jordan Valley, and down is the right word. They started near a lake already 700 feet below the level of the sea. Then they followed the river south, dropping the whole way into the deepest scar on the surface of the earth. They reached Jericho, an oasis of palms and water, the lowest city in the world, about 800 feet below sea level, warm, green, and the last easy step of the trip. Because from Jericho, the road turns west and stands up on its hind legs. In a single stretch about 15 miles, it climbs more than 3,000 feet out of the green and into the Judean wilderness. Bare rock, no water, heat that kills, ravines where men hid and waited for travelers who fell behind the crowd. This is the road, the literal road. When the Gospels say he went up to Jerusalem, they're not being poetic. You do go up. Every muscle in your legs knows it. The phrase is topography before it is theology. And then, near the top, you come over a rise and you see it. Herod's Temple, the most ambitious building project in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. A man-made mountain of white stone, plated in gold, so bright in the sun that ancient writers said it hurt to look at. Now remember whose eyes we are borrowing. A builder's. A man who had spent years setting limestone in a provincial town, suddenly standing in front of stones the size of railway cars, fitted so tightly you could not slide a blade between them. He would not just see the holy place. He would read the masonry. He would know in his own hands what it took to lift those stones, and how many backs and how much tax money paid for it. So hold the whole picture together, because the collision is now set. A builder from a burned region's backwater, son of a royal-blooded widow, raised in the memory of Roman crosses, carrying a message built out of debt and day labor and a lost coin, walking at the most crowded and most flammable hour of the year straight into the one place where Rome, the priestly aristocracy, and a sea of angry pilgrims all pressed against each other. Everything about where he came from put him on a road that ended at that temple. And what he did when he got there is the act that got him killed. Here's what we can responsibly say happened, with the legend turned down low. During the Passover crowds in the vast outer court of the temple, Jesus made a scene. He turned over the tables of the money changers and drove out the men selling animals for sacrifice. A disruption. A piece of street theater with a hard edge aimed at the commerce running through the holy place. The devotional retellings want this to be a small spiritual house cleaning. A righteous man tidying God's house. Give that reading its due, and then look at why it cannot be the whole story. Because of the timing, the place, and who was standing on the roof. The timing was Passover, the festival of liberation, the one that remembered God breaking a people out of an empire. This was a celebration of the Exodus from Egypt, and to some, any kingdom's tyranny for that matter. Every year it packed Jerusalem with crowds, and with exactly the kind of energy that makes occupiers nervous. The Romans knew it. That is why every Passover the governor came up from the coast with extra troops and posted soldiers above the temple courts, watching for the first spark. The place was the temple, and the temple was not only a holy site, it was the economic and political engine of the whole society. The chief priests who ran it were the local aristocracy, and they held their power by an arrangement with Rome. Their job, the job that kept their families rich and safe, was to keep this enormous crowd calm and keep the empire happy. A prophet causing chaos in the temple court at Passover was not a theological irritation to them. He was a threat to the whole arrangement that kept the lid on. So watch the machine work, because the Gospels themselves show it. The authorities do not debate his theology and lose. They decide to remove him, quietly, away from the crowd, before festival energy can turn into a riot with his name on it. That's not a religious decision. It is a security decision. Name it for what it is. It is crowd control. At the top of that machine sat Pontius Pilate. We do not only know him from the Gospels. We have his name carved in stone, and we have the writers of the age describing the kind of governor he was. They describe a man quick to violence and careless with Jewish sensitivities, willing to send in troops and spill blood to make a point. To an official like that, a Galilean with a following making trouble in the temple at Passover is an easy decision. And the method tells you everything. They did not stone him as a blasphemer, which is what the law prescribed for a purely religious offense. They crucified him, which is what Rome did to one specific kind of person: rebels, slaves, men who challenged the order of the empire. That tells you what kind of death this was. This wasn't the death of a heretic. It was the death the empire handed out over and over to provincial men who drew a crowd and would not go quiet. The men in charge were frightened of exactly that, and frightened men do not argue, they act. But you cannot seize a popular man in daylight at Passover, so they waited for the dark. And to take him in the dark, they needed someone on the inside. The rest of his death is a story about the family that ran the temple for Rome, and that family is going to walk back into this film at the very end of it. They took him at night, in a garden, away from the crowds, exactly as the security logic predicted. One of his 12 walked the arresting party in, and then he was handed up a chain of power that ran straight to Rome. The first stop was a house, the house of Annas. And to understand who killed Jesus and later who killed his brother, you have to understand that house. Annas was a former high priest and the head of a dynasty. Rome had deposed him years earlier, but he never let go of the power. 5 of his sons would hold the high priesthood after him, and so would his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who held the office the year Jesus died. For decades, this one family ran the temple, banked its wealth, and kept the order Rome demanded. They were not the Jewish people. They were a small, Roman-backed aristocracy, and most ordinary Jews could not stand them. So when the Gospels say the chief priest moved against Jesus, this is who they mean: the house of Annas. The collaborator family whose entire job was to keep a Passover crowd from turning into an uprising. A man announcing a kingdom with 12 disciples named to rule it, who had just overturned tables in their temple, was the precise thing they existed to shut down. Remember the name, Annas, because 30 years from now, at the very end of this film, one of his sons is going to convene a court and condemn another brother of this same family to death. The house of Annas does not appear in this story once. It appears twice. It is there at the killing of Jesus, and it is there at the killing of James. The pace itself is striking. A capital case unfolds under cover of darkness during the holiest festival of the year. And by dawn, the outcome is already decided, whether legal or not. The proceedings carrying the appearance of haste. And it is a pattern worth remembering. When members of this same priestly family later move against James, they will once again act when circumstances favor speed over scrutiny. But the priests could not carry out the death they wanted. Only Rome could crucify. And crucifixion was the point, because a cross is a public billboard and a quiet stoning is not. So they did what collaborators do. They repackaged the charge for the man with the real power. Before their own council, the accusation was religious. He had blasphemed. He claimed too much. In front of Pilate, that would have earned a shrug. Rome did not crucify men over Jewish theology. So in front of Pilate, the charge became political. This man claims to be a king, the anointed one, a rival to Caesar. And that charge Pilate understood perfectly. A Galilean claiming a kingdom at Passover with a crowd behind him? To the governor, the ancient writers remember for sending in soldiers and spilling blood to keep order? It was not a hard decision. He signed it. The cross was a Roman sentence, handed down by a Roman official for a Roman crime, sedition against the empire. Now here's the part the critical historians beg you to see, and it matters more than almost anything else in this film. Watch what happens to this story as the Gospels get written. Decade after decade, further from the event, while the movement is trying to survive under the very empire that did the killing, in the earliest Gospel, Mark, Pilate is the judge, and the sentence is plainly his. By Matthew, written later, Pilate is washing his hands and a crowd is taking the blame. By John, the last of the four, the villain has quietly shifted from the Roman governor onto a flattened group the text just calls the Jews. Read that drift for exactly what it is. As the young movement reached out toward the Roman world and away from its Jewish roots, it had every reason to make Rome look reluctant and the Jewish leadership look guilty. The blame slid off the empire and onto a people. That single shift would help feed 2,000 years of slaughter against Jews, often calling them Christ killers, and by the earliest evidence, it is a distortion. A Roman governor crucified a Jewish prophet for a political crime with the help of a collaborator priesthood that most Jews despised. That is the history. Everything stacked on top of it came later, and some of it came for the worst reasons human beings have ever had. So the order is given, and we go back one last time to the hill where this whole film began. So, we come back to the hill where we started. Passover, the crossbeam, the bored soldiers throwing dice, and the woman in her late 40s near the front of the crowd watching. Everything we have built brings us here. The builder from Nazareth, the disciple of John, the heir of David who walked into the temple at the most dangerous hour of the year, turned over the tables, and frightened the men who held the city for Rome. So they did to him what Rome always did to a Galilean who pulled a crowd and carried the word kingdom. They nailed him up where everyone could see, under a sign that named the charge, the King of the Jews. And near the end, out of a dry throat in the language his mother taught him, he says the thing the earliest gospel writer could not bring himself to soften, the cry we have held back since the first frame of this film. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? A dire question thrown at a silent sky by a working man dying the death the empire kept for rebels, and his mother heard it. Think about what she was watching. The cross was not new to her. She had been a 16-year-old mother in this same country when Rome raised 2,000 of them to break a revolt, close enough to see the smoke go up. She had spent her whole life in the shadow of this exact machine, and now it had her firstborn. That should be the end of the story. A mother, a dead son, an empire that won. For almost every other man crucified on those roads, it was the end. We do not even know their names. This one, the story refused to let end. Within a few years, his followers were saying something that should have been impossible, that the executed man had been seen alive. Whatever you make of that claim, it is the hinge the next 2,000 years turn on. So we have to look at it straight. Here's what we can actually say, with the legend turned down low, about what came next. Not what you have to believe, what a historian can document. The earliest evidence for the resurrection is not an empty tomb. It is a list. Paul, writing to Corinth about 25 years after the crucifixion, quotes a formula he says he received already finished, which means it's older still, dating to within a few years of the event itself. And it does not describe a stone rolled away. It describes appearances, people who said they saw him. He was raised on the third day, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Read the list for who is on it, because the whole dynasty hangs on one name in the middle of it. Then he appeared to James. James, the brother, not a stranger, not a crowd. The risen Jesus, in the oldest tradition the movement owned, appears to his own brother. And that is staggering because of what the Gospels quietly admit about James before the crucifixion. For not even his brothers believed in him. During Jesus' life, his own brothers, James among them, did not follow him. They thought, the Gospels hint, that he had lost his way, and then he is executed. And within a few years, that same doubting brother is not merely a believer. He is running the whole movement out of Jerusalem. Something turned James. The earliest creed names what the family believed turned him. He saw his brother alive. Now, I have to be honest here, as we were about his father, because it's the same kind of honesty. Whether Jesus actually rose from the dead is not a question history can answer. It is the resurrection version of the line we could not fill in on Mary's certificate. History could stand at the edge and report what it sees. It can tell you the followers were crushed and scattered and finished, and that something happened that convinced them, fast and for good, that they had seen him alive, and that this conviction turned a dead movement into one that outlived the empire that killed its founder. History can document the belief, and everything the belief set in motion. It cannot walk through the door of the tomb. That door, like the question of who his father was, is one you cross on faith, or you do not cross at all. It is not mine to cross for you. What we can follow is what the belief did. And to follow that, you have to know what resurrection meant to a first-century Jew. It was not a ghost, and it was not a single soul drifting up to heaven. In the apocalyptic hope these people carried, resurrection was the event at the end of the age, when God raises the dead and remakes the world. So to say that Jesus had been raised was to say the end had started. The kingdom he preached was breaking in. The clock had begun to run. And people who believed that did not wander off to start a new religion about going to heaven. Not yet. They stayed in Jerusalem, in the temple, keeping the law, waiting for the kingdom, exactly as he had taught them. A Jewish movement expecting the end of the world, led now by his own blood. The family took over, and the clue to how that happened, to who exactly stepped into the dead man's place, had been hanging on the cross the entire time, in a line the Gospels almost managed to bury. In John's Gospel, at the cross, the dying man looks at his mother and at a disciple beside her, the one the Gospel only ever calls the disciple whom Jesus loved. And he says two short lines, "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother." And from that hour, the Gospel says, that disciple took her into his own home. The church decided centuries later that the disciple was John the fisherman, one of the 12. James Tabor argues that this is not just unlikely, it is close to impossible. and once he lays out why, it is hard to unsee. Start with the Jewish law and custom, which is the only frame that matters at a Jewish deathbed. When a man dies, his widowed mother does not pass into the care of a friend, or a business partner, or a favorite student. She goes to the next son. The eldest surviving male of the family takes her in. It's not a preference in that world. It is an obligation close to sacred. And Jesus had brothers. We met them at the very start in his hometown. James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. James was the next oldest after Jesus. So when Jesus, dying, places his mother into the hands of a man standing right there, the entire weight of his own culture says that man is his brother James. Handing your widowed mother to a fisherman from the lake while your own next brother is alive would have been an insult to the family and a breach of the law. It just does not happen. And there's a detail from the night of the arrest that drives the nail in. When Jesus is taken to the high priest's house, the Gospel of John says 2 of his people follow him there. Simon Peter and one other, the same unnamed disciple the Gospel keeps circling back to. And it tells us something about that other one that should stop you cold. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, while Peter stood outside at the door. Known to the high priest? Now try to make that fit a fisherman from the Galilee. It does not. A man who hauled nets on a provincial lake did not have a personal connection to the most powerful religious official in the country, the head of the house of Annas, the family that ran the temple for Rome. Whoever the beloved disciple was, he was no Galilean nobody. He was someone with standing in Jerusalem, someone who could walk straight into the high priest's own courtyard because the people in that house knew his face. Tabor argues that points to the family, the relatives of a man claiming the throne of David, a household of priestly as well as royal blood by the oldest traditions, the brother who would go on to lead the movement out of the Jerusalem temple itself. James the Just was a known figure in those courts, and there is a cold edge to it. The family had proximity to the very house that would destroy it. The high priest's circle knew the beloved disciple by sight, and 30 years later, a son of that same high priestly house would convene a court and have James stoned to death. So why does the gospel hide the name? Tabor's answer is the thread that ties this whole film together. By the time this gospel was written, the movement had a problem with Jesus' family, because the family had been running it, and the people now in charge had every reason to write them out. Watch what the text does. It never names the beloved disciple, not once. It calls him the disciple Jesus loved and leaves the name blank. The same blank we just left on Mary's certificate, where the Father's name should be. The same silence that turned Mary herself into a statue. Again and again, the same thing happens. Certain voices are pushed to the margins, and eventually out of the story altogether. In Tabor's reading, the beloved disciple is James, the next son in line. And what happens to James after the cross is the piece of the story that Christianity almost entirely forgot. Ask 100 people who led the movement after the crucifixion, and 99 will say Peter or Paul. The earliest evidence names someone else. It names James, the brother. This is not a late legend. It is Paul, the same Paul who gives us that earliest line about the bloodline. Writing to the Galatians, angry, defending himself, Paul describes going up to Jerusalem to get the movement's leadership to sign off on his work, and he names who runs the place. I saw none of the other apostles, except James, the Lord's brother. Later, listing the pillars of the whole church, Paul puts one name first, not Peter. James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars. Go to the book of Acts, the movement's own account of itself, and watch who has the last word. There is a furious dispute over whether non-Jews can even join. Peter speaks, Paul speaks, and then James settles it. He gives the ruling, and the ruling stands. Therefore, my judgment is. That is not a follower. That is the man in charge, and the early church fathers knew it and said it plainly. They remembered James as the first leader of the Jerusalem church, installed not by a vote, but by his brother. They called him James the Just. They said he prayed so long and so often in the temple that his knees grew hard as a camel's. The Jewish brother of a Jewish Messiah, leading a Jewish movement out of the Jewish temple for some 30 years. This is the dynasty, Tabor argues, was hiding in plain sight the whole time. Not a religion about Jesus, not yet. A family movement, led by its own blood. The Davidic heir is killed, and the leadership passes the way a throne passes to the next brother. James takes over, and the sources say that when James is gone, it passes again to another relative, a cousin named Simon, a bloodline, a dynasty. Exactly what you would expect from a family that believed it carried the line of David and the hope of the two anointed kings. And then the same machine that blanked the father's name and silenced the mother went to work on James. The movement that became Christianity remade itself around Paul's mission to the Gentiles and the towering figure of Peter, and the brother who actually ran it for a generation faded to a footnote. Most Christians alive today could not tell you Jesus had a brother named James, much less that James led the entire thing. He was blotted out, like his mother before him. But history did not lose how he died. For that, we have a witness with no stake at all in the Christian story. We have Josephus. The year is 62, more than 30 years since the cross. The Roman governor of Judea has just died, and his replacement has not yet arrived. There's a gap, no Roman in charge, and into that gap steps the high priest, a man named Ananus. Josephus tells the story plainly, and he's no friend of the Christians. He says Ananus seized the moment, convened the council, and condemned a group of men to be stoned. At the head of the list, one name, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. This was not the will of the Jewish people. Josephus says the opposite. The most fair-minded men in the city, the ones most careful about the law, were horrified. They judged the execution lawless. They protested it. They went to the king and to the incoming Roman governor and reported Ananus. And for it, Ananus was stripped of the high priesthood after just 3 months. James was not just killed by his people, he was killed by one corrupt official exploiting a gap in Roman power over the protest of the very community he came from. The same shape as his brother's death, a Galilean of the line of David, too dangerous to the men clinging to power, removed before he could gather a larger crowd. A later tradition adds the image most people half remember without knowing where it comes from. The 2nd century writer Hegesippus says they took James up onto the parapet of the temple, the high corner above the valley, and they threw him down. He survived the fall, and they finished it with stones and a club. The story says that as he fell, he prayed for them. We cannot confirm the fall from the temple. We can confirm the death, the year, and the injustice, because Josephus hands them to us. James the Just, the brother, the second head of the dynasty, stoned to death in Jerusalem in the year 62. He was carrying the torch of the way after John and his brother for decades. Now, find Mary one last time. If the oldest traditions are right that she was still living, she was very old by then, near 80. A woman who had been a teenage mother in a burning country, who had carried a child no one could name a father for, who had raised a household of sons alone, who had stood on a hill and watched Rome crucify her firstborn. And now, an old woman, she gets word about the second, James, thrown down, stoned, gone. 2 sons, both heads of the same dynasty, both killed by the powers that ran her world, for the kingdom they believed was coming. She outlived them both. In the most tragic way, a mother watching the death of her 2 boys die horrific deaths likely ended her life. How could she live any longer after this? Go back to that line from Nazareth, the one we read when we first asked who Mary really was. The people of his own town named his mother, and then, in the same breath, they named 4 brothers and waved a hand at his sisters. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? 4 brothers by name, sisters plural, and enough of them that the crowd gestures at the lot as if everyone in the village knew them. That is the oldest gospel we have, putting a full house of children around Mary without a flicker of hesitation. And then, for most of Christian history, every one of them quietly disappeared. And those 4 names are not random. James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. They are the names of the patriarchs and the heroes of Israel. The names a proud, observant Jewish family gave its sons. Joseph and Mary were not naming children after Greek gods or Roman patrons. They named a house full of boys after the sons of Jacob and the Maccabee fighters, the way you do when you believe your family is part of the story of Israel and its God. The names alone tell you what kind of household this was. Devout, Jewish, soaked in the old hope, the same hope 2 of those boys would later die preaching. To understand where they went, you have to meet the belief that could not survive them. By the 2nd century, a conviction was hardening in the church that Mary had stayed a virgin, not only before Jesus was born, but for her whole life. Ever virgin, the title goes. It became one of the most cherished doctrines in Christendom, held in the East and the West alike, and it deserves a fair hearing. It grew out of real reverence, a sense that the woman who carried God into the world should be set utterly apart, untouched, pure from the beginning to end. For anyone who held that belief, a house full of ordinary younger children was not a minor difficulty. It was impossible. So the children had to become something other than what Mark plainly called them. There were 2 ways to do it, and the church tried both. The first came out of a 2nd century legend called the Proto-Evangelium of James. It made Joseph a much older man, a widower who already had children when he married Mary. On that reading, James and the rest were Joseph's sons by a dead first wife. Stepbrothers, no blood of Mary in them at all. Eastern churches still teach that version today. The second came from Jerome, the scholar who gave the Latin Church its Bible, at the end of the 4th century. Jerome thought the stepbrother story was beneath everyone because it still left Joseph with a first marriage and a sex life. So he proposed something tidier. The brothers were not brothers, they were cousins. The word for brother, he argued, could be stretched to cover a wider kinship. So brother of the Lord really meant kinsman of the Lord. He was arguing against a man named Helvidius, who had said the obvious thing, that the brothers were brothers. Jerome won. His cousin reading became the standard teaching of the Western Church. And most people who hold it today were never told it began as an argument Jerome had to win. Now, set the doctrine aside and read the sources cold. Mark does not say cousin. He says brother, adelphos, the plain Greek word for a male sibling. And he counts 4 of them on his fingers, with the sister standing right there. Greek had a perfectly good word for cousin. The gospel did not reach for it. Now give the other side its strongest form, because it has one. In the Greek of the Jewish scriptures, the word for brother does sometimes stretch to cover a wider kinship. Lot is called Abraham's brother, when he was really his nephew. So, in principle, brother could be read loosely. That is the open door Jerome walked through. But here is what shuts it. Greek already owned a precise word for cousin. It is anepsios, and the New Testament uses it in another letter to mark a man as someone's cousin with no confusion at all. The writers had the exact words sitting in their vocabulary when they spoke of the brothers of Jesus over and over in Mark and Paul and Acts and Josephus. Not one of them reached for cousin. Every one of them reached for brother. You do not get to claim the loose meaning when the precise word was right there and nobody used it. Paul is harder still to wave away, because Paul actually met the man, writing about his own visit to Jerusalem decades before any gospel existed. He identifies James with 3 words: James, the Lord's brother. The Lord's brother. From a man who sat across a table from him, who had every reason to be exact about who held authority in Jerusalem. And then there is the witness from completely outside the faith, the one with no stake in Mary at all. When Josephus records the killing we just watched, he reaches for the same ordinary word, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. A Jewish historian writing for Romans, with no interest in Christian doctrine, calls James the brother of Jesus, flatly, the way you would name someone's sibling. The stepbrothers reading and the cousins reading both exist for one reason, not because the text asked for them, because a later doctrine needed them. And the brothers were never a quiet, hidden detail in the early church. They were a known group out in the open, named as leaders. Paul, defending his own rights as an apostle, mentions in passing that the other apostles travel with their wives, and so do, in his words, the brothers of the Lord and Cephas. The brothers of the Lord and Cephas. Interesting. The brothers of the Lord, listed as a recognized rank of traveling leaders, right next to Peter himself. When the book of Acts opens, in the days just after the crucifixion, it gathers the whole family into one room. The apostles and the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And it says, without a hint of awkwardness, his brothers. The mother and the brothers together at the founding of the movement, not cousins drifting somewhere at the edge of the story, the center of it. So every layer we have, Mark and Paul and Acts alike, treat the brothers of Jesus as exactly what the word says, brothers, present, active, in charge. The reinvention of them as cousins or stepsons does not come from anywhere near the events. It comes centuries later, from a church that had fallen for a different Mary and could not keep the real mother and the perfect virgin in the same frame at once. And notice who vanishes most completely: the sisters. Mark says they were there, in the plural, known to the whole village. We do not have a single one of their names. The brothers at least got recast and argued over. The daughters of Mary were simply dropped, unnamed, the way women so often fall out of the records that men keep. A house full of children, and history kept 4 names and a throne and let the rest go. And 2 of those brothers left their own fingerprints inside the New Testament, in books still printed in every Bible today. There is a short, fierce letter that opens by naming its writer, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Brother of James. Notice what he does not say. He does not say brother of Jesus, even though that was the connection that would have carried the most weight in the entire ancient world. He reaches instead for his human brother, James, the one running Jerusalem. Even the family writing in their own hand stepped carefully around claiming the Lord as a sibling. It was already becoming the kind of thing you did not say out loud. Then there is the letter of James, attributed to the brother who led the movement for 30 years. It is not a sermon about a dying and rising God. It is Jewish wisdom, hard and practical, about holding your tongue, caring for widows and orphans, and the way the rich grind the faces of the poor. It sounds far less like the Christianity that came after, and far more like the Tecton's brother who grew up on Mary's song. The family's own voice survived, tucked into the back of the book, saying the family's own kind of thing, and most readers walk right past it without ever realizing whose voice they are hearing. There is even an old argument buried in that little letter. James writes that faith without works is dead, that a faith which does nothing to feed the hungry or clothe the poor is no faith at all. Set beside Paul, who taught that a person is put right with God by faith and not by works of the law, it reads like an answer, even a rebuke. Scholars still debate whether James is correcting Paul directly, but the tension is real, and it is the tension between 2 versions of the whole movement. The family's, built on deeds and the law, and Paul's, built on belief. Both ended up in the same book, arguing with each other across the pages. And that came at a cost. And the cost landed on Mary. To keep her a perpetual virgin, the church had to empty her house. The woman this entire film has been trying to find, the widow who raised 8 children through revolt and crucifixion and outlived most of them, was rebuilt into a woman with 1 miraculous baby and no ordinary family at all. Her motherhood, the very thing that shaped John and Jesus and James, was dissolved to keep a statue spotless, and the statue only kept rising. Over the centuries that followed, Mary climbed. She became the Mother of God, declared so by a church council at Ephesus in the year 431. She became the Queen of Heaven, the one carried bodily up into the clouds, the face in 10,000 paintings, haloed and crowned and entirely alone. The higher she rose as a symbol, the further she drifted from the actual woman, and the more impossible her real children became. You cannot have the Queen of Heaven raising 7 more babies on a dirt floor in Nazareth. So the babies had to go. The price of making Mary perfect was making Mary childless. Except for the one son the men writing the creeds could not do without. There was a second casualty. It was the whole argument of this film. If James is fully Mary's son and fully Jesus' brother, then the leadership of the early movement ran through one family by blood, which is exactly how a dynasty runs. Turn the brothers into cousins, and that bloodline blurs. The succession stops looking like a royal house and starts looking like a club that simply chose its officers. Erasing the brothers was never only about Mary's body. It was about hiding a throne. So the family was edited on 2 fronts at once. The mother was lifted up out of reach. The brothers were written down into cousins. But there was one part of this family the editors could not reach, because it left its mark not in scripture, but in the records of Rome. The dynasty did not end when James was thrown from the wall. It ran on for generations, and the empire was still afraid of it. Sometime near the end of the 1st century, 2 farmers were pulled off their land in Galilee and marched under guard to stand in front of the most powerful man alive, the Emperor of Rome. They were not generals. They were not rich. They worked a small plot of ground with their own hands, and the emperor had sent for them in person because of who their great uncle had been. Their great uncle was Jesus. To see how Jesus' family ended up in front of a Roman emperor 60 years after the cross, follow the one thread the church could not quietly edit, because Rome kept its own records of the people it feared. Start in Jerusalem. Right after James was thrown down and stoned, the movement did not scatter and hand itself to a stranger. It did what this family had done at every turn. It reached for the next relative. The man who took James's place at the head of the Jerusalem community was Simeon, also called Simon, the son of Clopas. And Clopas, according to the early historian Hegesippus, was the brother of Joseph. That makes Simeon a first cousin of Jesus and James. The leadership passed again inside the blood. There was a name for these people in the early church. The relatives of Jesus were called the desposinoi. It means roughly the ones who belong to the master, not by faith, but by family. For generations after the crucifixion, the people who led the original movement out of Galilee and Jerusalem were Jesus' own kin, the desposinoi, running the church the way a household runs a family trade. And they knew exactly who they were. The early writer Julius Africanus says the relatives of Jesus spread out from the Jewish villages around Nazareth, and that they carried the family genealogy with them, the record of their descent, and could recite it. They were not a vague clan that happened to share a hometown. They were a family that kept its papers, that knew it came from David, and that moved through the country as living proof of the line. In a world where a royal pedigree was a political claim, that is not a quaint family habit. It is a flag carried quietly for generations. And that is dangerous, in literally the most literal way. Rome had not forgotten what this family claimed to be. The line of David was a royal line, and under occupation, a royal line is a list of future kings waiting to be born. Our sources tell us that after the Jewish War, the emperors went looking for anyone who could claim descent from David, and to tear the hope of a Jewish king out by the root. Vespasian began the hunt. His son Domitian, suspicious and cruel, kept it going. It helps to understand why the blood of David frightened Romans this much, because it was not loose paranoia. The Great Revolt of 66 had been lit in part by a prophecy. Josephus, who lived through that war, says it plainly. What had driven his people to fight more than anything else was an ambiguous oracle found in their own scriptures that about that time a man from their country would become ruler of the world. The rebels read it as the promise of a Jewish king at last. Rome read it as a fuse. Josephus, always the survivor, announced that the oracle had really pointed to Vespasian, the Roman general who became emperor in the middle of the war. But everyone knew what it had originally meant. A king out of Judea from the house of David, after a war fought over the exact hope. No emperor was going to leave the actual heirs of David farming quietly in the hills. And the hunt led straight to the family. Hegesippus, writing in the 2nd century, and preserved for us by the church historian Eusebius, tells what happened. Soldiers brought in 2 men from Galilee, the grandsons of Jude, the brother of Jesus, Davidic blood, the exact blood Domitian was trying to destroy. What follows is one of the strangest scenes in all of early Christian memory. The grandsons of Jesus' own brother are standing in front of the emperor of Rome, accused, in effect, of being born into the wrong family. And Domitian asks them 2 things. How much are you worth? And where is this kingdom of Christ you people keep talking about? And when does it arrive? Their answer is not a sermon. It is closer to a tax return. Between the 2 of them, they say they own a single plot of land, a few dozen acres, which they farm with their own labor, and out of which they can barely pay Rome its tribute. And then, the story says, they held up their hands. Calluses. The split, hardened hands of men who break ground for a living. That was their defense. Look at us. We're not raising an army. We're raising barley. And the kingdom, they told the emperor, was nothing he needed to fear. Because it was not a kingdom of this world or this age. It was heavenly. And it would arrive at the end of things, when Christ came to judge the living and the dead. Domitian looked at the worked hands of the great-nephews of Jesus, decided that 2 peasants were no threat to his throne, and let them walk. Hegesippus says he even called off the wider persecution, and the grandsons of Jude went back to their farmland and went on leading the movement in their own country. And here the honesty has to kick in. This scene comes from Hegesippus, again from the 2nd century as a Christian, through Eusebius, writing more than 200 years after the cross. The polished details, the exact dialogue, the emperor's tidy change of heart, have the shape of a story told and retold and improved. But the bones of it line up with everything else we can check. Rome did hunt the line of David. The leadership of the Jerusalem movement did stay inside Jesus' family for generations. And the family really were working people, not aristocrats playing dress-up as the poor. And it was not only the relatives at the very top. Eusebius preserves a list of the earliest leaders of the Jerusalem church and flags something most readers slide right past. For the first several generations, every single one of them was a Jew. 15 bishops in unbroken succession, all of them, in his phrase, of the circumcision, leading a Torah-keeping community in the city where the whole thing started. That lasted until the Second Great Revolt, when Hadrian crushed the last Jewish uprising in the 130s and barred Jews from the city altogether. Only then does the leadership of the Jerusalem church pass into Gentile hands. For as long as there was a Jewish Jerusalem to lead, the movement there stayed exactly what it had been on day one: Jewish, law-keeping, and run from inside the founder's own people, with his own family at the head of it. The bloodline kept paying for itself. That cousin who took over after James, Simeon, son of Clopas, led the Jerusalem community for decades, and then under the Emperor Trajan, around the year 107, the old man was arrested, tortured, and crucified. Eusebius says he was about 120 years old. The charges against him were two: that he was a Christian, and that he was of the house of David. Put those two charges side by side, because together they are the whole argument of this film in one breath. 3 generations after the baby in Mary's arms watched the crosses go up around Sepphoris, Rome crucified his cousin for the same 2 crimes that had shadowed this family from the start, following the kingdom and carrying the blood of a king. Clearly, some exaggeration happens claiming he's 120 years old. But is there bedrock to this tradition that we're pulling on a thread? You see, that is the proof the Gospels never bother to spell out. You do not interrogate a metaphor. You do not haul a man off his farm and measure his land because his great-uncle told people to be kind. Rome chased his family across most of a century, emperor after emperor, because Rome understood precisely what the later church would work so hard to soften: that this was a royal house, that its claim was a throne, that the kingdom it kept announcing was meant to land on the ground in this world, in the place of the one Rome had built. When the Great Revolt finally came in the year 66 and Rome marched south to crush it, the tradition says the Jerusalem church did not stay to die with the city. Warned, Eusebius writes, by a prophecy, they fled across the Jordan to a town called Pella and waited out the war that flattened the temple and ended the old world. They lived. But the city that had been the family seat for nearly 40 years was gone, and the heart of the whole movement went with it. With Jerusalem gone, the center of the whole thing drifted out into the Roman world, into Gentile cities, into the hands of people for whom a Torah-keeping family of Galilean farmers was an embarrassment to be managed rather than a dynasty to be honored. And from there, slowly, carefully, the family was painted out. The mother into a statue, the brothers into cousins, the heirs into a footnote in a church history almost no one reads anymore. And the family's own version of the faith did not die when Jerusalem fell. It went underground, and it lasted for centuries among Jewish followers of Jesus that the growing Gentile church would learn to call heretics, the Ebionites, a name that means roughly the poor ones, kept the original shape of it. They held that Jesus was a man, the human Messiah, born of Joseph and Mary and chosen by God, not God walking around in skin. They kept the whole law of Moses exactly as James had, and they threw out Paul entirely as a traitor who had abandoned the law and invented a religion the family never preached. There were others holding the same line, the group sometimes called the Nazarenes, out in the towns east of the Jordan. To the church that was winning in Rome and Antioch and Alexandria, these people were first an embarrassment and then a heresy, to be named, condemned, and forgotten. But here's what they actually were. They were the closest thing left on earth to the movement as the family had run it. Torah-keeping, Jewish, fixed on a human Jesus and a kingdom coming to the ground. The people the church branded heretics were the ones still holding the original. And their name is the last turn of the knife. Ebionite comes from the Hebrew for the poor, the very word that sits at the dead center of the family's own message. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom. Mary sang that the poor would be lifted and the rich sent away empty. Her sons preached it on the hillsides, and the people who held that line the longest, who went on calling themselves the poor ones long after the rich Gentile church had moved on to thrones and basilicas, were condemned as heretics for it. The poor ones lost to the Queen of Heaven. So see the bind this family was in from two directions at once. To Rome, the blood of David was a throne to be hunted, and they crucified for it. To the church that was winning, the same family was a Jewish embarrassment, too human, too bound to the law, too plainly the relatives of a man they now called God. Rome wanted them dead for being a dynasty. The Gentile church wanted them gone for being a family. Caught between the spear and the gold leaf, the people who actually started the whole thing were squeezed out of their own story. And all of it came within a hair of vanishing completely. We know about the Desposinoi, about Simeon, about the grandsons standing in front of Domitian, almost entirely because 2 or 3 early historians happened to write it down, and because Eusebius centuries later happened to copy them out before the originals were lost for good. Pull those few pages, and the entire dynasty drops out of history without a trace, leaving only the gold leaf mother and her one divine son. The family survived, barely, in the footnotes of the very men who were busy replacing them. But the records caught what the doctrine tried to bury. Teenage mother from a village you could cross in 2 minutes set something loose, that Rome was still crucifying her descendants over 100 years later. Which brings us, at last, back to her, and to the only question this film has really been asking. What, exactly, did Mary set loose? There is a way this story is usually told, and it happens up in the sky. A heavenly Father, a divine Son, a virgin lifted into the clouds, a holy family glowing in gold leaf on 1,000 church walls. This film has been about the other version, the one on the ground, on earth, not in heaven. A real woman from the hills of Galilee who got pregnant as a frightened teenager, kept the child, and raised a house full of children through one of the most violent stretches in her people's history, who watched 2 of those sons grow into the anointed hopes of that people, and then watched the powers of this world kill them both for it. And the family was erased. The mother became a statue. The brother who actually led the movement became a footnote. The whole earthly family was painted over in gold until you could not see the people underneath. But the people were not the only thing buried. The message was buried with them. the thing they actually lived and died for. Ask most people today what Jesus came to say, and you get some version of this. He died for your sins, and if you believe it, you go to heaven when you die. That is the gospel that conquered the world, and is nearly the opposite of what this family stood on a hillside and preached. They were not selling a ticket out of this world. They were announcing the repair of this one, the kingdom of God on earth now, a real order breaking into a real world, where the empire's boot comes off the neck of the poor, where the hungry are filled, where the people who clawed their way to the top by crushing everyone beneath them are pulled down off their thrones. And that does not begin with Jesus. It begins with his mother. The oldest words the New Testament ever puts in Mary's mouth are not meek and mild. They are a battle cry. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. That is the voice that raised John and Jesus and James. A widowed mother who taught her children long before any of them was called a prophet that the world the powerful had built was not the world that was supposed to be. Her sons carried her song to the river and the synagogue and the steps of the temple, and they did it without a sword. They did not raise an army. They raised a demand. Bring the mighty down, lift the lowly up, feed the hungry, tear out the lines that rank one human being above another. And the powerful did what the powerful always do. John lost his head. Jesus and James were handed to the cross and the stones by the same corrupt priestly house. 3 men from one family killed for the same dream. But the dream did not die with them, because it was never really about them. It was about a world set right, not in a cloud, but here, on the ground they were standing on. No empire grinding the poor, no high priest selling God by the ounce. The hungry fed, the humble lifted, the powerful answerable at last. That is the message that got erased, and it is the one worth digging back out. Not because of who said it, but because of what it still does. 2,000 years later, it still names every tyrant who climbs to the top on the backs of the poor. It still indicts every system that calls its own cruelty order. A teenage mother from a village too small to find on a map looked at the most powerful empire on earth and said its day was ending, and the people it stepped on were going to be raised up. The empire that killed her sons is dust. The high priest who condemned them is a name in an old book. Her message is still standing. Mary was never a statue. She was the first voice of the most dangerous hope human beings have ever carried. That the last will be first, and the powerful will answer for what they did to the small. That hope outlived Rome. It will outlive whatever is sitting on the throne the day you watch this. And it leaves every power on earth that rules by fear with the same question it left a high priest and a Roman governor 2,000 years ago. What are you going to do when the lowly finally stand up? Thank you again to Aaron at Jesus DeChurched for funding this documentary and making this video possible. I hope people will subscribe to his YouTube channel. It was his vision, and with the help of brilliant scholars and friends like Dr. James Tabor, that his ideas were brought to life. The books he wrote, which inspired this, was the Jesus Dynasty and the Lost Mary. I ask that you like this documentary, share your personal thoughts in the comments below the video, and share this with your friends. If you really love the ideas presented by it, consider signing up for Dr. James Tabor courses at mvp-courses.com. He has 4 courses with us so far and several more to come. You can own them for life. They're in very high quality, and he also does personal Zoom meetings with his students in those classes. Oh, and never forget, we are MythVision.